right now the persuasion elements, the influence elements of the battle over Bitcoin and the shock of 45,000?
So there are two broad types of influence on people. I think, and if you want to put it in economic terms, it's really the micro and the macro. Cialdini's focus was really one-on-one individual, whether it was sales or corporate relationships or whatever interpersonal relationship, that sort of influence, those sorts of persuasion is where he focused his work on. And for sure, there's a lot of that going on in the crypto space. The broader approach is really the one taken by Bob Shiller of Yale, who focus on narratives and how these storylines can influence not person by person, but entire crowds all at once. And I think what we're seeing with crypto, especially given Elon Musk's most recent announcement, is a combination of both. The story driving the entire crowd, but the people who feel like Elon is speaking directly to them, that's more of the Cialdini persuasion approach.
And what's so interesting here, Barry, is the uproar now, positive or negative, whether you believe in Bitcoin or not and all that, doesn't speak to the institutional structure of Bitcoin. Do you have an understanding of the institutional underpinnings of Bitcoin?
Of how it's produced, or how large institutions
how it's produced, how it's the bid and demand, the Marshallian cross of Bitcoin.
Well, you know, a lot of this traces back to the financial crisis, where we saw a monetary but not a fiscal response to try and save the economy. That just poured fuel on the fire to all sorts of concerns about income and wealth inequality, as well as, quote unquote, fiat currency. And it's not a surprise that a lot of people who were deeply, deeply frustrated by how the economy was saved, not why it was saved, but the methodology used, got frustrated with central banks and centrally planned economies, even in ostensibly capitalist countries. And this is sort of a way, this is a libertarian way to step back and say, let's allow the marketplace to determine the value of a currency. Hold aside the fact that the marketplace does that with FX, obviously. But the idea that no one government can control something was really, that's the narrative that drove the early adopters into Bitcoin.
Barry, there's a larger question here, too, which is how much the backdrop has really changed right now as we head into the next economic cycle. I mean, Joe Weisenthal of Bloomberg Markets was talking overnight about how this, for the first time, feels like perhaps we really are getting a change, a fundamental change in the economy with perhaps a higher inflationary kind of tilt. I mean, do you think that that is valid as somebody who invests in index funds, who's somebody who invests more broadly in the markets, that we are entering a new regime where there's a new paradigm ruling?
So first, I have to begin by pointing out that we have seen a decade's worth of, longer, 12 years worth of forecasts of inflation and hyperinflation and currency depreciation, and they have been nothing but wrong because they completely misunderstood the output gap, both in employment and production, and that you don't get inflation when you merely have low rates, and you don't get inflation when you have merely have some fiscal stimulus. So they've been wrong. I was just reading a piece, I don't want to name shame anybody, but from August 2009, warning about here comes inflation, the Fed is doing it, and it really reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy works. One day we'll have inflation, one day we'll have wage pressure, but to get to that, you need a whole lot of things to happen besides zero interest rates and a few trillion in fiscal stimulus. You need pretty close to full employment. You need pretty close to big ramp up in GDP production, and you start to need a shortage of assets, not a handful of houses in the Hamptons or in Palm Beach, because there's only so many and we're supply constrained. you really need demand far exceeding supply. And we're years away from that. So the short answer is no, I'm not worried about inflation in 2021. We could talk in 22 and 23 and see the state of the world.